you join me with a motherboard and other parts ready for a build. In today's build, we're going to build a PC that starts out as having the lowest possible specs we can find to run Windows 11, and then see how it progresses up to an actual useful setup with minimal upgrades along the way. So the minimum requirement for Windows 11 that I can work with is 64 bits. So for that I've gone with AMD's Athlon 64, which was the first 64-bit processor on the x86 platform. This is an AM2 one. They did start out on socket 935, which was DDR1, but essentially the core is the same. I'm running that on an AM2 motherboard from Gigabyte. If we look at the upgrade options, it seems we might be able to take this up to a quad-core Phenom in the end. But that naturally won't just happen easily. Nothing on this channel happens that easily. There's always a few stuff up along the ways. So let's see how this all progresses. And there we go, our build is complete with absolutely no attempts made at cable management. So let's see if this even boots up if we give it some power and switch it on. Yes, it does so. It switches on, which is good, and then it just switches itself right back off, which is not good at all. But for now, I got it booting, and if you see there, the BIOS is still on version F2, which was the initial release version, and we need to go up to version F9D. So this was one of the first BIOSes to actually include Gigabyte's QFlash utility. So I've got my USB floppy hooked up with the latest BIOS on it. So I'm going to attempt to update from it. However, it seems this utility is so basic, it does not talk to USB floppy drives. It actually needs to be a floppy drive connected to the floppy header on the motherboard. So let's see if we reboot, if this can actually boot off the floppy, and if we can flash it in. And yes, there it is, some reassuring floppy boot noises. And it is loading MS-DOS, so hopefully we can flash this from DOS. And the command is very simple, just F, which is a batch file which does everything for you. And you can see it's loading the BIOS file from the disk, and then erasing the 512K flash memory BIOS chip and writing a good new wholesome BIOS to it. And our BIOS update was a success. Now I've gone ahead and written a Windows 11 image to the SSD. I used Rufus. I did have to modify a few options. Obviously we've got no TPM, no secure boot. We had to remove the processor requirements, and also I had to enable an MBR/BIOS boot because this is not a UEFI board. This power meter here we're going to be using quite a bit today to see the efficiency of the various processors we're going to try out. And in terms of drivers, I just went to the latest drivers available from NVIDIA for this board. I think it's 64-bit Vista drivers, but it worked just fine. On Windows 11 I had no issues running it. So with that said, let's boot into Windows 11 and let the testing fun begins. There you can see our single core Athlon 2 GHz. I do not recommend running Windows like this. It's really slow on a single core. Got a stopwatch there. We're going to be doing some performance testing with Cinebench R32. As I said, Windows 11 is extremely slow on a single core. I would recommend a quad core, but let's see how slow exactly. So I've started stopwatch, started Cinebench. Let's see how that goes. 2 minutes 20 seconds, and it started to draw the tiles one block at a time. This is a single core processor. We're already 1 minute 30 into it according to Cinebench's timer. To give you some perspective, this is my daily machine. It's a Ryzen 7 5700, 8 core 16 thread, and that's round about the performance you can expect on a modern 16 core processor. A lot fast rendering, 16 tiles at a time. In terms of time for one run on a modern processor, we're looking at about 1 minute. Went down from 10 minutes to 9 minutes. Checking back in on our single core Athlon, and it's nearly finishing this run. Remember, this hardware is coming up for almost 2 decades now. I think this was released in 2005. Yeah, last tile finishing there. We can stop the stopwatch. 1 hour 18 minutes for a single pass in Cinebench R32. We're idling at about 50 watts. We've used nearly 0.1 kilowatt hours for this operation, and our low is 50 watts with a high of 80 watts. And we got 172 points. So I'm going to draw up a table here which we can use for comparison as we go along, but there is our first result. Now you'll recall the machine switched itself off initially, and I had to take it out of the case in order for it to run stable. So let's see if we can figure out what is that. I'm suspecting it's a wiring issue or something. And there we go, with the power supply running flat in the same orientation it wasn't the case, the machine switches off. So I bought the best, and with that I mean the cheapest, new power supply I could find that has a 12 centimeter fan, and it turns out to be this one. It claims to be 400 watts and it is from Premium Sun, a very dusty box, but at least the power supply smells new, and it's shrink wrapped with a nice sticker on the side telling us more about it. So let's do a little compare. This is the old 550 watt I had. That's our new 400 watt, and it's got some figures on the side. The new one doesn't seem to have 2 plus 12 volt rails, and it's also have a lower amperage, and the minus 12 volt is also a bit lower. It's got numbers that makes no sense to me, so I think let's do the more scientific test, which is just to weigh it, because weight is good. So that's a 10 kilogram power supply, the old one, and our new one comes in at 3/4 of that, at 7.5 kilograms. Let's see how this goes. Let's give it some power and see if the blue smoke comes out. Well, no smoke. Let's switch it on. Still no smoke, and our machine boots. That's all good signs if you ask me. Got a noisy fan here. Now that's soldered and rattling the power supply. Seems that it's stable and it can lie flat. That's marvelous. That concludes the test of this power supply. It's obviously rock solid, passing my extremely scientific power supply test. And bang it around just for good measure. In terms of stability, I thought let's give it another run in Cinebench just to make sure it can run through with no issues. We're nearing the end here, still above an hour. And there's our last tile coming in. We actually shaved off 5 minutes off the time. Is that significant? I don't think so, but still. Let's look at the figures, what we're working with. We've used 0.005 kilowatt hours less, which is good. Our wattage, lowest wattage is slightly up with 1 and so is our high with 1 watt. So yeah, not a big change, a little bit faster, probably just for shits and giggles. We can include that in our results. Next up, I also managed to found the first dual-core processor, which was released by AMD, which is the Athlon 64X2. So let's start a Cinebench on this and see how it compares to that single core we had. So it is running pretty well. Our consumption has gone up now to about 93 watts while running. And at just over half an hour in, we're nearing the end of this process. So we've only doubled the cores, it's still running at 2 gigahertz. I did upgrade to this beautiful deep cool cooler, still the cheapest you can get, so I went with it, working pretty well. We've gone up to 381 points, managed that in 35 minutes, and if we look at the power figures, we've got a low of 55 watts, a high of 95 watts, and our total consumption has gone down significantly. It's almost half of what it was, which makes sense because we ran for half the time with double the processors. Maths, yo. Now, one issue that needed to be addressed was RAM. And this is the first time I've ever bought 4 GB DDR2 modules. Now, DDR2 typically tops out at 2 GB, and you won't find any Intel setup that is happy with these 4 GB modules. In fact, if you look at wish.com, where these RAM modules came from, you'll see a lot of the cheaper ones are advertised as AMD only. That is because AMD, again with another first, integrated the memory controller onto the CPU, and that allowed them to do neat tricks like running AM3 with DDR2 RAM, and also supporting higher capacity modules like these 4 GB ones. So let's install one and see if our goodies from wish.com actually works. And yes, it does. 4 GB on a single stick at DDR2 800. So, assuming the first one works, we can assume all the rest works, so let's just go for broke, plop all of this RAM in, and see what happens. Okay, let's hammer delete to get into the BIOS. No, that's not happening. Clearly the post test is unhappy, got a beep, most likely that RAM. So let's see if only with 2 modules we have any success. Yes, we do. We've got 8 gigs running DDR2 800, so that's great. Let's hop up to 12 gig RAM, 3 modules, should be single channel mode. But instead it is in no channel mode, it fails to initialize the RAM. Now I tinkered around with this quite a lot. I think I managed to get it going if I manually lowered the RAM speed. It was extremely infuriating, but I just thought let's get a better processor, because better processor equals better memory controller. This is the processor that arrived from China, and they definitely want us to give them a positive rating with that beautiful note. So let's get this installed in the machine and see if it makes any difference. You see there the Athlon 64 dual core is out and our Phenom is in. Gonna apply some very cheap heat paste to it. Snap my fingers and our fancy cooler is installed. Now let's boot this sucker up and see what it does. Now here's where I learned another lesson in this build. I had another little setback. It turns out the processor that was sent to me is not the 95 watt instance, it was the 125 watt. I did some research into that and found that the CPU part number differs ever so slightly. The seller did refund it, he wanted his positive rating, and yeah. So a few months passed and I imported this 95 watt item from the US. Because it ran so well for the last couple of months, I'm yanking out the old power supply and dropping a bomb on it. If your barcode's a bomb, you know this is going to be well. In goes our phenom. And this is the only way to properly apply thermal grease to a processor. Nice and secure, the coolers in, and dropping in our new cheap power supply. It comes with a plug that's completely useless in South Africa, but let's wire it up and see how things goes. Look at that. That's a few performance whatevers there with that cool RGB. And as a bonus, it actually boots up this time. We've got DDR2 running 667 with our quad-core phenom. Everything updates, it's happy. We boot into Windows, and if we look in Task Manager, we see, wow, 3 GHz, 4 cores, a lot of cache. And Windows in general feels pretty snappy until it blue screens, which is never a good thing. Now, I did have this issues with the 125 watt processor, so I rebooted, fearing the worst. But as you see, that's a graphics corruption because we're using onboard RAM, so that's actually a good sign. It means our RAM is running too fast. So I just dropped it back all the way to DDR2 400. We've got our 16 gigs of RAM there, and that worked pretty well. So let's reset the power meter, fire up Cinebench, and see how well it is on this quad-core processor, rendering 4 tiles at a time at a moderately faster pace than our original single core. And if you see here, it's finishing the work there. It's finishing the first run with 1 minute 30 to go, and it's got 1588 points. We got a low of 95 watts, a high of 153 watts, and a total consumption of 0.04. An annoying cat. So this is what we end up with in terms of the numbers from the tests. Quite a big difference between what we started out with and what we ended up with. Phenom is still usable today in Windows 11, depending on what you want to do. And I'm sure there's even a few motherboards on AM2 that will allow you to run the 6-core processors, if you're lucky enough to find that. But that's all we're going to cover in this video. It was a pretty cool build. I didn't make a loss on this, so that's always nice. And thank you for watching.